Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 5, Types of War, Conventional War, Limited War, and Nuclear War. And this lecture we are going to discuss nuclear war. Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been, as of today, the only instances when nuclear weapons were actually used in war. They were used at a time when the Americans had a monopoly of such weapons. The Soviets were to develop their first nuclear weapon in 1949, followed by the British in 1952, then the France in 1960, and the Chinese in 1964. Of recent countries that entered openly this nuclear weapons club are India and Pakistan in 1998. Today, Israel and North Korea are suspect of having nuclear weapons, and some other countries like Iran of aspiring for them. While atomic weapons have not been used since the end of the Second World War, there has been a significant improvement in their design, their destructive power, and their sophistication of design. Given the phenomenal destructive capability of such weapons, if used by the warring countries, and a realization that any conceived nuclear war would only end up destroying both the warring countries along with a general destruction elsewhere. Strategic thinking about the nuclear war has revolved around their non-use rather than their use. Earlier theories of deterrence and brinkmanship have evolved into sophisticated arguments on how to avoid a nuclear confrontation. This section on nuclear war focuses on the evolution of nuclear strategy with special reference to American and Soviet strategies, wherein nuclear strategy is really a study of the known use of nuclear weapons. Now let us understand the key concepts. Before we examine the nuclear strategy of these two superpowers, it is necessary to understand some of the key concepts that are used in the discussion on nuclear strategy. The first is deterrence. The advent of nuclear weapons changed the perception about approaches to security. Traditional approaches to security had argued for a strategy of defense or offense. Thus, a nation could achieve security through its ability to defend itself from an attack or take an offense posture to repel an attack. The introduction of nuclear weapons changed the strategy to be used for security of the nation. The perception here was that both the parties to the dispute possessed nuclear weapons and had the ability to use them against the adversary. Defense as a strategy simply meant that one would deny the opponent what he seeks to gain from the conflict. Deterrence was a different strategy. If the opponent was seeking for some gain, then one would thwart the opponent from using force by projecting a possibility of some sort of reprisal for the original action. Simply put, it meant that the opponent would to pay a price for the action that has planned. This is a threat that one gives to the opponent to desist from use of force. One would argue that if the opponent was seeking territorial gains, he would have to pay a price for that. It was a sort of a punishment for the action that he would take. What is more important is that one would have to be clear on communicating to the opponent what price he may have to pay for his proposed action. This price that one is asking from, or the punishment that one would impose on the opponent, would have to be credible. The threat has to be credible. The opponent must believe that if any action is taken, he would have to pay the price, and that the threat that is issued is not a bluff or a hoax. Finally, one would also have to keep certain options open for the opponent to seek a face saving resolution. This process consists in influencing the mental calculations of the opponent. The entire process is conducted prior to the actual action being taken by either party. One establishes a psychological relationship with the opponent. This psychological relationship is called deterrence. It is useful only before the actual breakout of war. Deterrence seeks to avoid a conflict. A war breaking out is a failure of deterrence. In a sense, deterrence has two contradictory concepts ingrained in it. At one level, both the opposing countries are in a state of readiness, armed with nuclear weapons. Both have the capability to strike and destroy the other, and also to retaliate if struck in the first place. Both are aware of each other's capability, as these are not hidden but are well exposed and exhibited. The communication between the rivals is kept open to indicate all the possible scenario of threat that may be used. Yet, at another level, simultaneously at to all of this, both seek to avoid the very conflict for which they are preparing. This is because both are unwilling to pay the massive price for their original actions. They are aware of the mutual vulnerability that they live under. They are thus prepared for a war that they both would try to avoid. If war does break out, the deterrence would have failed, and then defense would have to take over. Now, the next point is brinkmanship. The term brinkmanship draws its origin from the analogy of a glass of water. Any glass of water has a limit to which water can be filled. That limit is its brink. If one continues to pour water beyond its capacity, the water would overflow. Similarly, any two nations have a certain limit up to which they can contain mutual tensions. If tensions continue to increase beyond a certain limit, which is beyond the brink. They would overflow into a war. There is an implicit meaning as also an assumption in the concept of brinkmanship. Both the opposing nations are aware of the rise in tension. Perhaps both are interested in increasing them for their own benefit. Both are aware of the brink up to which they can raise the tension. At the point they would reach the brink, they would ensure that the tensions are de escalated to avoid a possible war. The Cuban Missile Crisis 1962 presents a classical case of brinkmanship. Both the Americans and the Soviets were in confrontation with each other over the naval blockade that the Americans had imposed over Cuba. Both took the tensions up to the brink. At that point, they suspected and feared that a war was likely to break out, and such a war would conceivably have been a nuclear war. Then the process of de escalation was initiated. The next one is coercive diplomacy. There are four elements in coercive diplomacy. The first is punishment, raise the cost of resistance to one's demands by inflicting direct or indirect suffering on civilians. Second, risk, target civilians, economy, and society. While punishment may involve a sudden attack on the enemy, rise risk strategy is a gradual punishment that one inflicts over a period of time. Third, denial. This is a demonstration of one's ability to defeat the enemy in a battle. Fourth, decapitations. This is a strategy to kill or overthrow top leadership or destroy the command and control system of the enemy. The next is compliance. The strategy of compliance is used if and when deterrence fails. This strategy is the use of force to make the opponents take some a specific course of action. Deterrence requires that the opponent desist from initiating a particular action. Compliance comes as a strategy to force the opponent to change the course of action initiated by him. Compliance optimally requires positive compliance by the enemy. This is different from the deterrence, as deterrence simply calls for inaction, while the compliance calls for positive action as one wants it. Compliance also calls for inflicting punishment if the compliance does not occur. Here we want to wind up this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.